Hello and welcome to yet another StratCom Talks. These are a series of conversations that we are having about issues that are important for our strategic communications community. And today's theme is how to protect armed forces in the digital domain. This is a theme that is very, very important for our strategic communications community, for our colleagues working within the Ministries of Defense and working within the armed forces. And actually, this is also a theme that Center of Excellence has done quite a few reports about. We've done red teaming exercises and we've done experimentation. And I hope that today we will also be able to touch upon most of the things that we have uncovered during many years of our experiments and reporting on these issues. At the beginning, I would really want to encourage you, those who are watching us live now, to write your comments in the comment section in Facebook and on YouTube, and send in your not only your comments but also your questions. And please don't wait until the end of the discussion. We will notice that most of the questions come in the last 15 minutes of the conversation, so you can write your thoughts already now, and we will try to discuss them here with our speaker. And today we have one speaker, and who is also a colleague of mine. He is a senior expert from Sweden, working here at the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence. He has been in charge of several of experiments that we've done and several researches that we've done. One of the latest is a look at data brokers. So let me please introduce you to Henrik Twetman.
Hello, Linda.
Yes, hi, Henrik, and thank you for being here. I'm very excited for this conversation, but before we get to it, and before I let you talk and tell about your experience and your thoughts, I thought that maybe this is a good opportunity to take a look at the conversation that I had last week with a major from Latvian Armed Forces. We had a small conversation about the issues that are challenging for them right now, how they are solving them, how they are looking at training and education, and which social media they are using. So let me introduce you to a small interview with Sandra Brāle. She's a major and a public affairs officer of the Chief of Defense of Latvia. Please, the interview.
Social media has become a very important communication channel, not only for civilian society, but for the defense sector as well. As national armed forces, we consider social media as a very powerful tool in order to inform society, to tell our story. As soldiers, we have to behave at the highest standards and follow values of national armed forces, and it doesn't matter offline or online. Since 2018, the personal accounts of soldiers, national guards and civilian workers are governed by internal guidelines. These guidelines define basic principles which should be followed by every single person who serves in national armed forces in order to avoid situations when information released publicly in private accounts can endanger operational security and influence capabilities of national armed forces. Social media is a very powerful tool, and it's important that every single soldier, National Guard and civilian is on the same page regarding media literacy. There are two groups which are more vulnerable. First of all, I would like to highlight soldiers who are new to National Armed Forces. Secondly, I would like to highlight their relatives and families of the soldiers, National Guards. And it's important to train soldiers, to educate regarding usage of social media policy, and to suggest them to discuss those issues also with their next of kin. By issuing social media guidelines, we have significantly decreased such misbehavior in social media, in private social media accounts of our soldiers and National Guards, because years ago we had some situations when information regarding operational security was regularly neglected on social media. For instance, our personnel published information on their fellow members, they published information on location of the units, equipment, weapon systems, etc. By issuing these guidelines, we have significantly decreased such cases. By issuing social media guidelines, we advise to our personnel that they should use the same media platforms which are used by National Armed Forces, that is Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Flickr, and TikTok as well, because we see TikTok as very popular amongst young people in Latvia, which are our future soldiers. We highly don't recommend for our soldiers to use social media platforms controlled by Russia, such as Kontakti, Odnoklassniki. We are monitoring situation on social media, but you must be aware that training and educating personnel, it takes time. It doesn't happen in one day, it takes years. We strongly believe that such drastic measures as ban of social media usage is not most appropriate way how to deal with social media. This is why we focus on training and educating our personnel. It's important to be aware that every single piece of information you publish on social media can be interpreted as official statement of National Armed Forces. Tactical actions cause strategic consequences. Secondly, it's personal vulnerability. It's important that soldiers and National Guards limit information they post on social media till maximum, because it's very easy to find a person if he or she has published photo in uniform. So to conclude, I would like to encourage my fellow members in National Armed Forces of Latvia, my fellow members in other NATO member states. Social media is about literacy. It's about training and education, so don't afraid to use social media, but use them wisely. There doesn't exist secure and safe social media, but it's all about training.
Yes, well, quite a few points taken. I think so. Personal vulnerabilities are very high on social media. There is no safe social media, and it takes years actually to train people how to survive in the social media environment with all the challenges that it faces, and it's of course all the time an environment that all the time changes as well. So she's also talking about specific more vulnerable groups on social media, and you also know about many experiments and red teaming exercises. So what is your take on vulnerabilities?
Yeah, that's a good question, Linda. And first of all, thank you for having me on today. I think the Major is bringing up a lot of really good points here. It's a very succinct summary of the challenges we see with social media. I especially liked her final words here, where it's social media are both an opportunity and a risk. And that's really an important realization here, that we can't see it as one or the other, because if we completely remove ourselves from social media, we're going to lose out on great opportunities. But if we are completely open about it and do whatever we want, we're going to have some significant risks. So it's also great to see that there's such a comprehensive strategy in Latvia, and that the strategy is actually paying some dividends here, as they've seen, as the Major mentioned here, that they've actually seen significant improvements after this strategy comes in. I think it's interesting here because the Major highlights a couple of vulnerabilities that I'm really keen to explore, and that we'll return to later as well. And one of them is families and relatives, which has been a much neglected area of this field. Social media, of course, is the problem when we ourselves post things that compromise our location or compromise our capabilities or our intent. But it could also be a problem with other people unknowingly post things that could be interpreted and analyzed to get that kind of information in the long run. So having the families as part of, I wouldn't say part of the problem, but considering the risks that come from relatives and families and people in your network is quite important, because they are often the weakest link. Another thing I took away from this is that it's important not to hone in too much on the risks related only to social media, but to really consider the risks from the digital domain as more of an holistic thing. Social media is really a big problem in many aspects, but it runs the risk of becoming a red herring when we think about managing risks, because it leads us into the pitfall of thinking that if we just manage social media, we will have taken care of all our digital risks. And that's a difficult and wrongful mindset to have, I would argue. Social media is one aspect, but digital risks and risks related to the more broader malicious use of digital information is much bigger.
So you are completely right saying that it's not only about social media, because I think it's easier to focus only on social media and neglect all the other digital domains that exist. And we have seen several also journalistic reports on geolocation data that is that derives not only from social media but from other applications or technologies that people are using. But so if you look at the military organizations, so what is that with what military organizations struggle when it comes to digital information environment today?
So if you indulge me a little bit to kind of expand on the context here from the perspective that we see it. So you mentioned, Linda, that we've been running lots of different experiments and writing lots of different reports over the years. And this comes from, of course, a broader interest in the digital challenges that we face. And I think a good point of departure is there was a report published recently from Ars Technica about the connected battle space, where they contextualized the issue that we're facing today by quoting Donald Rumsfeld, who say that you go to war with the army you have, not the army you wish to have or to have at a later time. And they pointed out that the US and NATO, to a large extent, the last 20 years, they've been trying to evolve into a modern force that they wish they had from the beginning, right? But some developments are really going faster than others. So we've been really good at adapting to some digital technologies and to some digital transformations. We have a very high rate of technological adaptation. We have command and control functions that are improving rapidly with new technologies. We have integration between different domains now to a much larger extent than we used to have before. And we have really well-connected sensors, and data is being managed much more efficiently nowadays than it used to be. And we're especially focusing on developing cyber capabilities across the board right now, which is also a really important thing. But there are other aspects that are not perhaps associated with the intuitive understanding that we have of military threats or military warfare. And they cannot really be neatly defined within and categorized within a military organization or mindset. So it becomes these blind spots, and malicious use of digital information is one of these blind spots. So if we just consider the notion of cyber, we spend a lot of time and resources on developing cyber capabilities, but there's not really a unified understanding of what cyber is and how it's supposed to be delineated. And that's a bit of a problem, because when we think about cyber and we read documents and policies about cyber on a NATO level, it generally refers to how we protect our means of communication and how we protect our information systems. So this definition doesn't really capture how digital information can be used to harm a military organization beyond penetrating our systems or hacking into our servers or disrupting our C2 functions, for example. So it doesn't really account for, on the one side, how social media can be exploited, on the other side, how data can be exploited generally, and on the third side, how open source intelligence can be collected on our digital behavior. And this, of course, creates significant risks, but some of these risks might seem a bit more basic than cyber risks, because you don't need to be a hacker or have advanced cyber capabilities to do these things. It's enough that you have a computer and a phone. And therefore, it seems like these risks would be less relevant, but in fact, they're quite detrimental to a military organization because it allows an adversary to leverage common technology in unconventional ways and have an asymmetric effects on our forces. So I'd argue generally that our understanding of the challenges of the connected battle space just failed to include some of the more fundamental and basic aspects. And therefore, we're quite far still from having the force that we wish we had. Like the major pointed out here, we're just now and just recently coming to terms with the risk of social media, and we haven't even begun coming to terms with some of the other risks associated with this domain. So we're still a bit off.
And well, I like your take on cyber capabilities. That is actually a very true way how to look at them, because it is a shiny, fantastic project to work on, and probably not as exciting as protecting yourself, because it's happening at the background, and maybe not everyone can see that actually you are working on these capabilities or taking these capabilities seriously. We've actually had already a few questions, and I think this would be a good time to pause a bit and take them. So you are talking about, of course, well, when we are thinking about the digital environment, it's of course all the time changing, and there are new players coming in, and there's a few questions about new players we've all heard about. One of them is Parler or Gab. And so that's kind of one part of the question about these new apps that are probably, we don't know, or sometimes we know from which countries they are coming in, or by whom they are controlled, or what are their moderation processes and what they do with the data. Sometimes we don't. So the question is about Parler and other apps, and the other one is about who is going to be the next Cambridge Analytica. So there's you did a report on the data brokers and looked at how much data can be acquired and how much it costs. So maybe a two-folded question for you now.
Yeah, so any type of new platform is of course a new unknown. We don't really know how new platforms work until we had some time to study them and see the results of how people's behavior on these platforms are being collected, and how data is transferred, and how it's being sold, etc., etc. So it's difficult to make a preemptive risk assessment, but I think it's fair to assume that whenever there's a new app, it comes with new flaws and new vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited. It's just about the creativity of the adversary. I mean, anything can be exploited if you're creative enough and if you have the resources and the skills to do it. I liked what the major said before about how they've created a list of social media apps that they think are fine for the soldiers to use. It was perhaps a bit controversial that they would include TikTok on this list, but from what I heard, it seems like they have a very sound target audience analysis and a reason for why they did so. So it's a conscious risk management choice. In that case, I think it's really good, because one of the problems with managing risk on social media is that we quite often fall to the side of wanting to ban social media or remove social media. And people want to use social media. So if you remove certain apps, or if you tell people you can't use these apps, then they'll find other apps that we know even less about that they'll use. So it's better, I think, to provide some freedom of maneuver for the individual soldier to be active in the information space, and to use a couple of different apps that they say, well, we prefer you to use these apps because these apps we understand and we know what kind of risks we're heading into. Sorry, Linda, I forgot the second part of the question. Oh, no, it was the new Cambridge Analytica. Yeah, I'm not sure we'll ever see kind of the same crisis twice. If we're going to have another situation like Cambridge Analytica, where a third-party company kind of collected data in the way they did. But we already know today from having studied these data brokers, which are companies that work with collecting and analyzing and selling on data, that there are other ways of collecting data and that this industry is quite unregulated. We continuously and regularly see these actors being targeted when it comes to hacking attacks and different penetration attacks, etc. I think it's a matter of time before we see something really severe coming out of one of these companies. To this extent, to my knowledge, at least this far, we have seen these attacks. We have seen negative consequences of these attacks, but they've generally been directed at, or they've been related to criminal purposes, for example, or scamming or exploitation. We haven't seen it in a military context yet, but I think that's just a matter of time.
Well, and one of the findings that we have in the data brokers report is also connected to GDPR, that in European Union, the regulation is a bit different.
Yeah. The GDPR is one of these protective kind of regulatory frameworks that I think is fundamentally quite good to provide checks on this type of industry. The problem with GDPR as it is right now is that it's lacking in enforcement. So it's really, really hard to keep track of who has access to your data. And even if you click yes on a terms and conditions page on a website, there's no way for you to know that these terms and conditions are actually enforced on the company side. So the company may sell the data on to one actor that's in line with the terms and condition, but then this actor maybe go bankrupt or something, and some other actor purchases that company and gains access to all their data and use it for something completely different. Or they just sell it on to someone else. And then when it's been traded 4 or 5 times, no one really knows what consent was given in the beginning. So the framework is fundamentally good, but the vulnerabilities related to this data are still out there.
Yes, so that means a malicious actor can use it if they wish to, and the good actors will be more restricted.
Definitely, it's an asymmetric relationship there.
And so we have looked at these challenges, and can you talk a bit about more practically? So how does it look in practice? What issues are military organizations facing today?
So I'll take 2 examples to exemplify this a little bit. I think the major in the beginning also mentioned how it's affected the Latvian military, with soldiers posting selfies, for example, and uploading information on social media that could be scraped by anyone. But we have 2 examples that I think are quite good. And one comes from the Red Team experiment we did in 2018. My colleagues working at the center ran an experiment in association with the NATO exercise, where they they sought to understand how publicly available data could be used to affect the military force. And they tested this by embedding a research team into a red cell within this military exercise. And using only social media and open source information, they tried to figure out what kind of data they could collect about the exercise, what kind of data they could collect about the participants of the exercise, as well as if they could use this data to influence the participants to change their behavior. And the results from this experiment, sadly, were that it was very easy to identify individuals participating in the exercise. We could collect really detailed information about both the people who were participating as well as the exercise itself, such as when the active phases of the exercise were and where the exercise was taking place, etc. And speaking to the major's point as well about limiting our presence on social media, the majority of this information would have been available even if the soldiers would have left their phones at home during the exercise. But what we then saw was that it was also quite easy actually to use this information together with very basic techniques of social engineering to reach this audience and also to influence their behavior, to do things they didn't intend to do from the beginning. And this is quite troublesome. The team who participated here could, for example, pinpoint the exact locations of specific battalions and identify the troop movements of said battalions in almost real time. They could also get people to change their positions depending on what they told them and depending on what kind of information they used to try to affect them. And all this stuff is really valuable intelligence, and it would require significantly less resources to collect in this open environment than it would if you used traditional intelligence practice. Normally, you would have to have recon units out and about in the forest looking at these people. You would have to have UMINT operatives who are trying to influence these people, or would you have to run a wide-spanning PSYOPs campaign to get these people to change their behavior. But our research team managed to do the same thing using Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, basically. Another case which I think illustrates the different aspects of the risks on social media and in the digital domain is or comes from a military info ops unit that a couple of years back during an international exercise used crowdsourcing techniques over social media to basically encourage citizens to post geotagged pictures of military vehicles in the area of operation. And this provided the team with a close to real-time flow of intelligence on troop movements, which it was good enough so it would have enabled kinetic targeting if it was for real. And this was considered so disruptive to the exercise that exercise management decided to shut it down because it had devastating effects for the way they exercised. They could basically just, pinpoint artillery on these battalions in real time. So this shows, I think, how these technologies could be exploited in different ways. It's not just about what you do or what your unit does or what your military force does. It's also about how you can use these technologies to crowdsource things and how you can exploit them in creative ways.
Well, and I think what's interesting in that particular experiment is that people were sharing information on social media that they would never share in real life. For example, if they were approached by a person, probably a spy, asking about troop movements or where he's going next week, that person would not share this information. but social media creates trust, and we of course also see it in the case of disinformation, that disinformation is not ever shared by people we don't know. It's usually shared by people we know or are acquainted to. So there is a certain level of trust within these applications as well.
Yeah, that's definitely true, and that's the problem of having our personal and private lives on the same platforms as we have our work lives and everything else. So if you're on Facebook every day, you become accustomed to the way Facebook works. You have all your personal friends on Facebook. It's quite disarming to be on these platforms for a long time, as we all are. And then when you're approached by someone who's perhaps in the same group as you and in the same network as you and have the same interests as you, and that person asks you a question that is, perhaps you shouldn't share it, but what harm can it do? This seems like a legitimate person. It's on Facebook, who cares? You become a bit desensitized to the risks on these platforms because we use them so frequently.
Yes, and a while ago there was also this one report. It was not done by us, but it was about LinkedIn, and it is a platform that is usually used for professional needs, and so people are more open to approve new friend requests on LinkedIn. And that's a great place where some people are creating fake personas that are supposedly working within the military, but they are actually just fake people who are collecting information about who is working where and who is doing what.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I haven't studied LinkedIn myself, but it would be really interesting to see, because it is quite a different platform from the others, especially because of its professional focus. So I imagine it's also quite disarming for people when they're approached on LinkedIn, for example, especially because LinkedIn kind of strokes your ego as well. If someone who has a recruiter profile approaches you and says like, "Oh, you look like such an interesting individual, would you be interested in, telling me a little bit more about what you do?" That's just classic intelligence gathering, but it's quite disarming because you feel flattered by having someone notice you on these platforms.
Yeah, well, as you said before, any platform can actually be used for malicious intents if there is a wish to do so. But one of the questions, I'm gonna echo one of my questions that also is raised by one of our viewers. So Jeff Black writes that comprehensive and recurrent operations security OPSEC training can inoculate all our personnel regardless of the platform. So basically, people probably are already trained and aware, and even before. Maybe 3 to 5 years ago, they were already trained and they knew about the risks of open source intelligence. So, what is the problem? Why it's not working that well?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll echo that sentiment that OPSEC training is really important and have a long-lasting effect. But there are some issues with the way we think about these preventive measures as well, and I'll get back to it in a second when I discuss one of the findings of our reports. But I'll just mention a personal experience when I was deployed, and we get OPSEC training before deployment, and people tell us that you're going to be in an area of operation now. We have fixed landline phones on the base and in the camp that you can use to call home, so you don't need to bother with bringing your own phones. That's just a vulnerability. So leave your phones at home and use the landline phones and the landline computers that we have at the base. And everyone's on board with that, theoretically everyone understands that, but as soon as you get down into the area of operation, people will still go out of their way to find a local SIM card and a phone so that they can use iMessage or Skype or whatever to call their families whenever they want. Because sometimes, the landline phones will be occupied, and that's an inconvenience. So we shouldn't underestimate the discrepancy between training and reality. Because it's quite easy to get people to obey to these policies when we are exercising or training. But I think it's a different problem when we have a real operation or a real scenario. And of course, it depends on what kind of military organization you're part of. But just consider as well a real life situation. If a country is involved in a prolonged military conflict or in a war, will you be able to tell your soldiers to leave their mobile phones at home? I think that not a lot of soldiers would obey that command because they need to have contact with their family. They want to keep track of how their family is doing. And it's one of these situations where we can't really, or we're not really training as we're fighting in this situation. Because during an exercise for 2 weeks, you can leave your phone at home. But during a prolonged conflict or a war, you won't get people to leave your phones at home. So the OPSEC trainings that we have and the measures that we have really need to kind of target the understanding of the problem and the risk mitigation side of it. So we can't eliminate the risk, but perhaps we can mitigate the risk by getting people to use their phones wisely. But then, of course, I should also just mention that there are, of course, situations where leaving your phone is really important, and that's what you need to do. But it all depends on the context, right? So kind of relating this to the research that we've done, we've done a lot of reports that are pinpointing the risks. And at the beginning of 2020, we wanted to take a different perspective on this and to say, or at least to explore, what can we do to mitigate the risks? And we developed a report that we call Camouflage in the Digital Domain that really builds on all the other reports that we've written previously, where we dug a bit deeper into what the risks were and how they could be mitigated. And we identified a couple of trends that we see as problematic in the digital domain that are related to, for example, increasing connectivity today, higher abundance and accessibility of data and digital information, more and more privacy-oriented platforms, and an increased speed of information transfer. And this leads to significant consequences across the board. But what's interesting here is that a high-tech actor like NATO and its allies are generally more susceptible to these risks than a low-tech actor, because as low-tech actors, they've been exposed to these risks before because high-tech actors have been targeting them. So they know what they are, they have experience from dealing with it, like phone surveillance, for example. Whereas NATO and its allies, we lack this experience because we've had a technological advantage for so long, we haven't been accustomed to having to mitigate and deal with these risks. So we've never had to question our reliance on technology before, but now we have to do so because less resource actors can leverage this asymmetric effect. And that's quite interesting. And like I mentioned, these risks really go beyond social media. Social media can surely be exploited for intelligence gathering and influence operations, but there's also risks related to, like you mentioned, Linda, applications that generate position data without you knowing it, applications generate behavioral data that you don't know about and don't understand, as well as data generated from all the Internet of Things connected devices that we have today. So if we could bring up slide 1 from my presentation there. This is just a slide that comes from the New York Times in the video they published a couple of years ago, where they looked into the fitness application Strava that logs your running and bicycling patterns, and puts them on a map so that you can see how far you ran and how quick you ran and where you ran, basically. And unbeknownst to most users, this data was also uploaded to an online portal that people weren't really aware about, but it was up there and anyone could access it. And what the New York Times did was that they went onto this heat map, they did a couple of searches, and they managed to pinpoint secret military bases in, for example, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Niger, as shown here on the picture. So it's a kind of inadvertent information leaking where you don't really understand the data you transfer and generate. And this is also a big problem, especially now since more and more devices are becoming connected to the internet. Your watch is connected to the internet, your phone is connected to the internet, your TV is connected, your fridge and your coffee maker are connected. Everything that's connected to the internet is a potential sensor. And these sensors can be accessed either via purchasing the data or hacking into the sensor, or by just exploiting the user's unawareness or lack of knowledge. Another similar example, we can bring down the picture if you want. Another similar example is, for example, wildlife or trail cameras that are available widely across the world today. If you go out into a forest and if you look around, you know, if it's close to a populated area, or if it's close to some hunting grounds or whatever, you're likely to find cameras that provide you with live stream videos. The same goes for road cameras, and the same goes for radar cameras, and all different kinds of streaming devices that are out and about in the world today. These resources are either publicly available, you can just log on to a website and access the camera, or you can access it using a search engine such as Shodan, or you can use your cyber operatives to access these devices covertly. So there's a network of sensors that we're not used to thinking about. How do you control for these things when you're a military commander and you're moving into an area of operation? That's really a big problem today. And finally, the same goes for the data that's available via purchasing. So we're only scratching the surface of the inadvertent leaking of information via, for example, social media and live stream videos. But that's nothing on the deliberate collection and scraping of personal information that data brokers are doing today. Like we talked about before, that one of the recent reports that we published looks at the commercial availability of data, both via legitimate actors and on the black market. And it's quite scary to see how much data is really available, how easy it is to get a hold of it. And if you have enough money, the extent of data that you can buy. You could basically get data on anyone and everyone and on everything, which is quite troublesome. So why bother collecting the data via social media when you can just buy it from a company? And this is also indicative of the kind of shortcomings we have when we think about the risks on social media, because your digital footprint is generated over time, and not only on social media, but across all the platforms you use on the internet that are connected to the internet, and all the apps you use, and all the devices that you use in your offline environment that also connect to the internet, such as swiping your credit card in a grocery store. All of this data is being collected somewhere, and it usually ends up with a data broker that has access to a wide variety of databases and data sets that they can combine and sell, that will provide very valuable intelligence to anyone that chooses to buy it and look at that data.
Thank you, Henrik. And well, it really reminds me of quite a while ago, Economist had a cover that said data is the new oil, and it was a big discussion if it really is oil or not, because not everyone can have access to it, and there's just too much oil, so to say, in the world today. A few questions that actually are also tackling this data brokers issue. So one is about Oracle and Google, who are, question is that Google and Oracle trade personal identifiable information, and no one is talking about that. And the other one is, I'm not sure you will be able to comment on that, but it's about SS7 GSM protocol vulnerability that reveals geolocation, which can be matched with OSINT.
All right, so these questions are actually quite related, I think, and it's because they're both related to the anonymity of data. And my take on this is that it's a wrongful assumption that any data is anonymous, because every piece of data is connected to some other piece of data. And if you just have enough data, you can cross-reference it to find out where it's coming from and who it's coming from. And the fact that Google and Oracle are trading, data that's personally identifiable, yeah, I think that's a problem. But any data is technically personally identifiable. It's lots of journalistic reports that show this. They've purchased data from data brokers that is allegedly anonymous, and then they just cross-reference it with open source data to find who the data belongs to. Just very simple. If you have a couple of GPS locations, if you have daytime and nighttime GPS locations for a specific device ID, then you can just go onto public registers and see who lives on that address, and then you can kind of infer who's behind that device number. So I think it's a bit of a misconception that any data is really anonymous. It just depends on how much data you have and how good you are at analyzing that data, whether or not you can de-anonymize it.
So, but Henrik, so what is the overall effect on all of this, and what can militaries do to protect themselves?
So I think the most obvious thing we need to state up front is that the operational environment is really changing due to the nature of emerging digital technologies. And these technologies are creating risks for military organizations beyond what we're prepared for, and also beyond what we're comfortable thinking about. This is an environment where much less resource actors can exploit digital information to leverage asymmetric effects to a much larger extent than we've seen before, and in a way that's much less costly than other collection efforts in cyber operations. So as the amount of data that's being generated continues to increase, this problem also continues to expand. So the reference that you made to data being the new oil, I know other people have made this comparison before, and that the difference is that oil is limited and data is not. Data is being generated at an exponential rate, more and more data generated all the time. So the problems we have today will not be the same as the problems we'll have in the future. And that's saying a lot because the problems we have today are already quite big. So we know that adversarial actors are developing their toolbox in this space as well. Both non-state and state actors alike are looking into how they can use these asymmetric effects to their advantage. And we also know that these actors like to target the weakest links. Like we mentioned in the beginning, sometimes families may be the weakest links when it comes to digital security. And in this case, these links are quite often outside of the military organization, in the form of compromising digital signatures generated not during work, but during your private life, unaware family members, like we mentioned, and also exposing, your personal unprotected private device could have the same effect. So it's a rather grim picture that we're painting here, that we have a lot of problems. So what can we do about them? From researching these issues over a number of different projects at the center, we realized that there's 3 critical factors that we think are important when it comes to dealing with this. The first one is that we need to speak to a target audience that's susceptible to our advice, right? So there's the policy level, and they're doing lots of work there. There's lots of people trying to regulate the data industry, for example, regulating social media platforms. So that's already, I shouldn't say taken care of, but people are already working on that. And then there's the individual level, which is, of course, really, really important. But I don't think we should blame individuals for creating risks in an environment where the risks are so difficult to understand. This is, from my perspective, really an organizational issue that organizations and institutions need to deal with without pointing fingers at individuals who don't understand the very, very complex picture. So when we developed this report, Camouflage in the Digital Domain, we wanted to speak to the kind of commander on the ground, the person who's responsible in the military organization for whatever operation or exercise that you're doing, right? We also we need to get these people to move beyond the narrow understanding of the problem, where we look at either this is a problem of social media or a problem of super advanced, complicated, scary cyber operations. The problem is somewhere in between. And we need to provide a framework here which provides a mode of analysis which is familiar to the audience that we're speaking to. So we can't come with really high up legislative suggestions to a military commander, because that will just be uninteresting to them. And we can't come with super practical, tactical advice, because that's not appropriate either. So what we decided to do was to look into the force protection framework, which is a well-established process within NATO and its allies. And it's quite curious how this framework was developed, because it saw the light of day in, I think it was the beginning of the 1980s in Lebanon, after a terrorist attack on a US military base, if I'm not mistaken. And this attack basically was allowed to happen because the militaries were not prepared for the threat that they were facing. This was during the Cold War, and war was seen as something between 2 big armies or something between 2 nuclear powers. And the military on the ground in Lebanon didn't really realize that there are other types of threats that are more relevant here and now, such as someone putting a bomb in a truck and driving that truck into our camp. So the force protection framework was designed as a process within the US, NATO, and its allies, with a set of sequential functions built around the assessment of threats, hazards, vulnerabilities, and risks. So we have a really good framework for analyzing risk. We just need to kind of provide some additions to that framework so that we can analyze digital risks within the same frame of mind as well. So what we did was to develop our own little framework that can be plugged into the force protection process that revolves around threat assessment, finding out preventive measures that you can use, and countermeasures that you can use to deal with digital risks. So if we bring up slide 2, I think you'll see this framework from the report Camouflage in the Digital Domain. And as you see there, this framework consists of 3 different parts, where the first one is an assessment part that revolves around having a very thorough risk and vulnerability analysis of your operation or your organization, depending on what context you work in. But basically doing an assessment of the risks that you face and the vulnerabilities that you yourself have. It's basically about doing a baseline analysis of the risks and vulnerabilities. And this relates to the nature of the area of operation you're in, how connected it is, who's in there, what target audience are in there, what social media is being used, what connected devices are in there. to also looking at your organization and what your soldiers are doing and what your units are doing and how they're operating. This is then followed by what we call prevent there, which is a step with preventative measures that are used to kind of strengthen your capacity to deal with these things. Here, it's important to have a very clear policy for social media use, like the major mentioned in the beginning. It's quite effective. And guidelines for how social media is being used. That's a very low-hanging fruit in this regard that can improve your resilience almost immediately. But there are other tools as well that you can use, such as strategic communication, that you can leverage to your advantage to kind of signal a PPP or posture, position, etc. The final step there is about defensive actions, such as how you work with identifying hostile activities in the space, but also how you work with identifying your own vulnerabilities in the digital environment. So one of the things that we routinely see is that people are aware that malicious actors are spreading disinformation online. So during an exercise or an operation, you have a team that's looking at the information environment to see what malicious activity is on there, but no one is really looking at what kind of information your own soldiers or your own units are putting up there. So there needs to be this kind of notion of, or there needs to be this capacity of allied forces to be able to discover both malicious activities, but also to discover what kind of information we upload and spread ourselves. So I'm not going to go into detail into all of these steps, but I think this approach is quite useful to a military commander who is not perhaps that into digital threats and digital risks. They can read this report and they can plug this framework into their planning process, and they'll come up with some interesting results of things they need to think about. But the basic idea is that digital risks beyond just social media use needs to be plugged into any operational planning that's occurring within a military organization.
Well, this framework actually, well, as any framework, it is very comprehensive. So, and suggests thinking about processes from the beginning until the end, and then revising what has happened, and then looking at the big, and then restarting the process again and again and again, and making it better based on the reality. It, well, for me as a communications manager, it a bit reminds me of any communications plan where you have to keep revising and just making it better. So, and as people probably could see, the framework is very comprehensive, and it has different layers and different players actually who are involved in making this into reality. What would be your main takeaways and recommendations based on this framework?
So I summarized 3 main points here for this conversation today, and they're on slide 3, if someone would be kind enough to bring that up. The first one is that removing the phones is not enough. A culture of digital security is what we need. And this is kind of a summary point to say that, this is an idea that's echoed across many organizations. So you routinely hear people in the military say, the problem is gone if we just get people to leave their phones at home. And I've already mentioned some examples of why this may not be the case. This builds on a very simplistic and mistaken understanding of both the issue and also the nature of digital space. Sure, if you're going to discuss classified information in a secure location, yeah, leave your phone at home because that's not secure. But it may not be viable in any situation. It may also be damaging to you to leave your phone at home from time to time, because when you're not on your phone, or when you don't have access to your phone, you create new risks that are related to, for example, impersonation or someone hacking into your accounts. Because when you leave your phone at home, you also lose a sensor in the information environment. There's also a misconception about when digital risks are created, because we tend to think that they're created here and now. If I upload a selfie with my geotag, that's me creating a vulnerability. But the fact of the matter is that digital vulnerabilities are created over a very long period of time. They're created continuously as we use the internet and as we use our services. So just because you leave your phone home during an exercise, it doesn't mean that your digital footprint can't be used to harm a military organization, for example, via intelligence gathering or via any other activity. It may also be that if you leave your phone home, if you're a regular internet user, like most of us are, and then all of a sudden your digital footprint stops for 2 weeks, and all other people in your network, their footprint stops as well for the same period of time. That's quite valuable intelligence to know who's participating in this exercise, for example. So leaving your phones at home or removing the phones is not enough. We need to foster this broader culture, which considers this issue from a different perspective. An illustrative example of this is on slide 4, if we could change the slide, please. This is again from the New York Times. They've done some really excellent reports on this. And this is a picture that shows geolocation tags from phones that have been left in cars on a parking lot outside of a CIA building. So yeah, sure, leaving your phone in your car is useful so that people can't listen in or wiretap your phone while you're in the building. But if your objective is, for example, to map out who works in this building, then it doesn't really matter if you leave your phone in the car, because your digital signature and your GPS footprint will still be able to reveal who's working in this building at what hours and stuff like that. So I think it's quite illustrative here that we need a broader understanding of the problem. We need to raise awareness of these many-faceted or multifaceted challenges that we're facing in the digital environment. We need to develop proper SOPs. We need to use our communications effectively to signal resolve and commitment to digital security so that soldiers and personnel understand that this is important. It's not a minor issue if you reveal your position during an exercise. It's a big issue. But we also need to think about other ways to create digital security, such as providing perhaps software solutions, such as VPN software for soldiers to use on their phones, both private and at work. Perhaps provide these services for family and family members as well. Provide secure routers and equipment that could help improve, just provide some kind of baseline protection. Doesn't have to be advanced necessarily, but it's just about increasing the threshold for malicious actors to access information and to use it in a bad way. The second takeaway for me would be at least that we can't shy away from discussing our own vulnerabilities. We use a red teaming methodology to discover some quite severe vulnerabilities in the way we worked ourselves, and that's considered quite controversial in our field. But in the cyber field, red teaming is regularly used to test capability and expose security flaws. And I think this type of methodology should be used more frequently within military organizations. But this requires really mature commanders and organizations which can handle the results of tests like this. So one thing that I personally encountered is that commanders refuse to introduce friction into military exercises that's caused by digital risks, because they perceive this friction to disrupt the exercise too much. This is a very short-sighted mindset, and it's quite damaging, I think, for the long-term capability of a military force when this happens, because if simple frictions are too disruptive for an exercise, imagine how the same frictions would disrupt a real operation or a real combat situation. So I think it's appropriate to apply the concept of train as you fight and fight as you train in this context as well. If you are to have any hope to have operational success in this area or in this field in the future, we need to include this in training, and we need to train it a lot. Finally, I'll end by saying that we need to develop our capacity to protect ourselves from digital threats and our capacity to use the digital domain to our advantage at the same time. This goes both for our ability to identify and counter threats as they happen, as well as to do the same with regards to the information we upload ourselves and the information that we leak ourselves. A critical factor here for this to be sustainable, I think, is to do it in a legitimate and ethical way. So just like we follow rules of engagement and have legal frameworks for warfare, the online space should be seen as something that we use in a regulated way as well. It shouldn't be seen as free for all to use information in any kind of way. Sure, we need to be clever and leverage opportunities here, but it should be done in a way that protects our basic values and the notions of freedom and democracy.
Thank you, Henrik. And well, actually, there are quite a few questions that are being raised about armed forces using data that is available by themselves against. To use it as counterintelligence capability, and the other one is about give me a second. So can't we vaccinate military from social media just by promoting good practice? So that's kind of a question about vaccination against social media. But yeah, what are your ideas about using the data that can be gathered and all these tools for counterintelligence?
So that's a $1 million question, because there's lots of opportunities in the digital space. And of course, we all wished we could leverage them to our advantage to achieve our strategic goals, but it has to be done within the kind of legislative and normative frames that we operate within. It can't just be, here's all this data, use it in whatever way you want, because we would consider that unethical. There needs to be checks and balances on this, and this is a much bigger discussion, and I'm not sure I'm the right person to draw a line in the sand here. I know that there's been controversial examples coming from security agencies of how they've used data. I mean, there was a report just recently about how I think it was the Secret Service in the US was purchasing data from data brokers to conduct investigations that would otherwise have required them to have a warrant to collect the same data themselves. And that's I see that as something different than a military problem. That's a democratic problem, and we need politicians and elected officials to kind of find that appropriate line in the sand rather than the practitioners, I think. Well, of course, there has to be an interplay, but it's a political problem, I think. About inoculation via best practice, sure. I think that works to some extent. It won't solve the whole issue, but it will surely help with parts of it. Like I said in the beginning, I think it's better to give people resources to do good things in this environment rather than to try to restrict them and limit them, because that will cause a backlash and that will cause people to do things that you didn't intend them to do just because they want to, everyone likes to be on social media and everyone needs to be online these days. So I think good practice and showing, how you can use these platforms, but in a good way, is better than trying to reprimand people for using them in the wrong way. Of course, both will be needed depending on context, but generally, yeah, sure. So inoculation will inevitably one of the important things of this, getting people to understand the risks and how they can act in this environment without causing any trouble.
So we have to slowly start wrapping up. A few things that I'm going to take by myself from this conversation that we had is that we need mature commanders that are not afraid to talk about these issues and to train personnel and do exercises, and are not afraid to show and talk about vulnerabilities that they have within personnel and within their armies. And another big thing is culture of digital security. I really hope that, I think every organization deserves this culture of digital security, be it military, government, or from the private sector. And before we wrap up, maybe I will also give floor to you. So what are your final thoughts and for this conversation?
Yeah, thank you, Linda. I saw a question in the chat actually, which was from Doug Jordan here, saying that we're slipping back and forth in this conversation between a public affairs officer perspective and a true IO perspective. And I would agree with that statement. And I don't necessarily see it as a problem, because the threat landscape in the digital domain is really broad. And we can't just look at it from one perspective like we're used to, perhaps. We need to consider the different aspects of this challenge. And our ability to do this will be crucial for our mission success in the future. We need to continue our general adaptation to the connected battle space on all fronts. We can't neglect force protection in this aspect. It is a matter of fact that if we can't deal with digital risks, we have a force protection issue. Because as we've seen, digital information and malicious use of data can be used for kinetic targeting and information gathering and intelligence gathering and so on. So this will be a decisive aspect of any future conflict. And I'd end with saying that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here that don't require us to invest in expensive equipment, the specialized personnel, or develop even further cyber capabilities, although this is things we should do as well. But awareness, education, training, and a mindset open to your own vulnerabilities, I think, goes a long way here.
Thank you, Henrik, and thank you for being with us today. I hope you have a great evening in Sweden. And well, thank you all for joining us, and let me please encourage you to share this conversation if you found it valuable. Please follow us on social media so you know about all of other StratCom talks we are having. We are going to have a conversation same time, same place next week as well, and we are going to look at Japan's strategic communications with great experts. I think it's going to be a very exciting discussion. I'm going to moderate it next week as well. And well, special thanks to George Chiesa, who asked a lot of questions and very insightful questions, and all the others who joined us in this live conversation with your insights. See you next week. Thank you.